Call to order, please. The special meeting of the City Commission for Tuesday, 30 May 2023 will now come to order. Please join me in silencing your cell phones. Now, the only thing between me and you is this podium and all this space, and I don't know why it feels that way, but it feels a little different, a little strange. But I want you to know that we're very excited to be here today and want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to be heard. So we're going to have the city manager, just so you know how this will go today. The city manager will do some introductions and preliminary background, and then we'll have our consultant come up and as an expert and do what he told you and we told you he would be doing. And this is a synopsis of his report, not his entire report. So we will then give you a chance for public participation based on what you hear and see to ask, to have a comment, or in this rare case, ask a question of our expert. So with that in mind, City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mayor Cleveland?
Here.
Commissioner Martin?
Here.
Commissioner McGurk?
Here.
And Commissioner Perrine and Vice Mayor Hartman are excused absent. Thank you.
Very good. Chair would entertain a motion to excuse the members.
Move to approve.
Second. Okay, any discussion on that? Very good. City Clerk, please call the roll.
Commissioner McGurk?
Yes.
Commissioner Martin?
Yes.
Mayor Cleveland?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, City Manager, would you please tee this up, sir?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And good evening to everyone. As you know, Mayor, at the end of last year, we had probably, I would say, the saddest moment in the city of New Smyrna Beach. And that's, we had the Hurricane Ian, and we had over 1,000 homes that flooded in New Smyrna Beach, which I've been in the city here since 1989. And we have never had such a catastrophe like this one. Immediately, right after we did some of the recovery, we went back to the commission, and the commission directed staff to hire a third party to investigate what happened in Ian, why did it happen, and then what could we do to prevent it in the future. Now, as everybody knows, stormwater management system in the city, specifically back in the 60s and 70s, I don't think there were any regulations that were followed. And then in the 80s, the city implemented some of the requirements, but in reality, probably I would say in the beginning of the 90s, when they start being strict on the stormwater management system, and then followed with the St. John's water management requirement as well. So most of the areas that were constructed in the 90s and above, I would say the majority of it were okay. However, the areas that were built in the 60s, 70s, and probably early 80s, where it's in low elevations, and close to any water body, I think they were heavily affected. Now, I don't know if anybody has gone through flooding, but I would say probably it's one of the worst things that somebody could go through. You know, you lose everything in your home. You don't have a home to live in. So that has a lot of impact on the city commission, on the staff. That's why we've done everything possible on the recovery part, and now we're doing this on the exposure analysis. It was difficult to find a consultant who has not done any development work in the city of New Smyrna Beach. So we had to go and look far enough to find Jones Edmunds to do this exposure analysis for us. Britt Cunningham is one of the, probably one of the best experts in the state of Florida in terms of stormwater. So Britt was hired. We had the kickoff meeting. We gave him everything we have in terms of information, pictures, anything we received from residents. He has it, and he used it in his analysis. So I want Kyle and Brett to come to the podium. I want Brett to be able to provide his PowerPoint, and then we'll be able to answer any questions that we might have. And also, Mayor, if we don't have the answer for the questions tonight, we will take all the questions and we will post the answers on the city website at a later date. So I want to make sure everybody who has questions, that their questions will be answered at some point. So Kyle and Brett, if you please come forward.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Just reiterate a little bit what the city manager already spoke about. As we all recall, in September of 2022, the impacts of Hurricane Ian and the devastating effects that over 20 inches of rainfall was distributed in less than a 24-hour period, crippling access to subdivisions for several days at a time, and flooding over 1,000 homes, many of which are still uninhabitable at this point in time. So there's lessons learned. There was lessons learned for our fire department, police department, maintenance operations, building department, engineering. All city departments learned something from this natural disaster. And this evening, we're here to evaluate a presentation from Jones Edmunds Associates that will hopefully mitigate or abate future such impacts with resolved natural disasters of this kind. Jones Edmunds Associates has developed an extensive 2D model which essentially replicates the overland flow and taking into account the surge in the high water level of Turnbull Canal. Within their report, they also examined the impact of some of the more recent subdivisions, being Venetia Bay and Coastal Woods, and did they contribute to the flooding downstream. They looked at our land development regulations, or some of the requirements, do they need to be revised or updated? They looked at possible maintenance issues, infrastructure. What can we do to help this area recover in a quicker fashion? So that the presentation is quite extensive. So at this point in time, I'd like to hand it over to Brett Cunningham with Jones Edmunds Associates to go over the presentation. And the format is just to go through all the slides at this point in time, and then the questioning will occur directly after the presentation is done. Thank you. Brett?
Thanks, Kyle. So if some of these slides look familiar, we did have the kickoff meeting, and I thought it would be important to go back through the slides that we have for the kickoff meeting. So the first 15 slides or so are going to be similar, some modifications. But it's good for those maybe that hadn't seen it, and then also to set the stage for the findings, which is kind of the more important part. So we'll go through the project. So we'll go through the project background, goals, scope, and then finally findings and recommendations, and then get into questions and comments. So the project background, as Kyle and Colin have laid out, is we've had Hurricane Ian. We had 20 inches with a very, very high surge to go with it. So we were really trying to answer the three questions of what happened during Ian, why did it happen, and how could it be prevented or mitigated. So that's really the essence of the questions. Just kind of as a recap, New Smyrna Beach, unfortunately was really at the heart of it. So the table on the left lists the totals, the rainfall totals from Hurricane Ian, and it lists the highest 8 gauges in Volusia County, and there were many more than 8. I'm just listing the 8, and you can see that the top 4 are all in or right around the city. So right around 20 inches of rain, plus or minus. If we compare that to NOAA Atlas 14, which is the most commonly used current source for rainfall, that puts us somewhere in the 500 to 1,000 year recurrence interval. And again, that's kind of with the rainfall record looking backwards. Looking forwards, we think that things are probably changing, but just kind of to put that all in reference. And typically, stormwater regulations are, our stormwater facilities are designed to control up to, say, 25-year or 100-year events. And what we got was significantly more than that. This slide just shows the 4 gauges that where the recordings took place, so in the 21 to 19-inch range. And we have some corroborative information as well. I'll show that later.
Brett, if you don't mind, do you want questions at the end or as we go from the commission?
If it's a simple question, I'll take them now. If it's just a
Could you go back to the
clarification.
previous slide? Could you
Sure.
talk us through the 24-hour duration and 2-day duration? Is that a modeling function?
So when we do rainfall statistics, we talk in terms of intensity, duration, and frequency. So the durations typically, for regulatory events, a design event, we look at a 24-hour event. In some cases, maybe a 72-hour event for closed basins. But it's very common for the 24-hour event to be what is used for regulatory purposes. I put the 2-day up here just because the storm spanned, the rainfall spanned a couple days, just for interest.
Got it. Can you talk to why you think it would not be closer to double in the 2 days than just a slight uptick from what a 1-day amount would be?
Because the 2-day would contain the 1 day, so typically when you're, as they're analyzing rare storm events, that 1-day event is probably part of the 2-day event or 3-day event. So it's just how the statistics are done. So there's never a doubling from one to the next.
Okay, thank you.
This slide just shows just from the coastal surge. So this is the DEP slip tool and what we know to be the coastal surge elevation. If we just applied that with no rainfall whatsoever, that shows you where the surge is. So anything that's blue, white, or green, that would have been just from the surge itself, not the 20 inches of rainfall. Another important aspect to this going in is this is your current FEMA map for the city. So anything that isn't purple is in purple, and maybe a little bit of the blue is in a special flood hazard area. So a fair amount of the city is in what's considered to be a FEMA special flood hazard area.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Has the FEMA map been updated since, 2017?
No.
Thank you.
So there was fortunately a lot of observations, and that was helpful for this study. So we had 1,300, almost 1,350 points. We had some photographs. We had just a wealth of information that we don't typically have. So a lot of information as to what actually occurred throughout the whole city. And it wasn't just flooding. So there, as you can imagine, there was a fair amount of erosion and other problems when you get that amount of rainfall. But we were really kind of focused for this study on flooding. And then we also had some additional information from when Nicole hit. This is not the first time that such a large event has hit. So in 1924, there was an event that was actually slightly larger, and it was very wet going into that event. So that one caused massive flooding in the city. One of the differences when you read the accounts is the water was around for weeks, if not months, and as bad as it was here, at least it receded reasonably quickly. So obviously things have improved from that perspective. Some other important aspects going into this project, into the background. As we were starting this, the moratorium had started. So there was the moratorium on new residential development of 10 acres or greater in A and AZE FEMA zones, and that was through June 27th. So we were trying to really meet a deadline that was going to be instructive for that moratorium. Likewise, we knew that the city had applied for a Resilient Florida Vulnerability Assessment Grant. During the course of the project, we learned that you've received one of the grants. We designed this project so that it could be used in partial fulfillment for that grant. So we tried to structure this project so that you wouldn't be reinventing the wheel. You could take some of this effort and apply it towards that. So all that led to the project goals of completing a comprehensive exposure analysis, focusing on Hurricane Ian, while also trying to help with the upcoming vulnerability assessment. We were to analyze the impacts of large new developments and their associated stormwater management systems to see if they're causing flooding to their neighbors. We also reviewed your stormwater code and standards for their appropriateness and to see if there are any improvements that we would recommend. And then we're here in the last task presenting the findings and recommendations. And then the scope really just follows the goals. So data collection, review of the standards, exposure analysis, new development, et cetera. The one thing I will point out is that the Jones Edmunds part does not cover the action plan, so that the intent all along is that an action plan would follow on top of this at a later date. This was our project schedule at the beginning, so we were to be done with data collection by the end of January, all the way through the new development analysis by end of April, and then this meeting was scheduled for May. So we are more or less on schedule. We made it to the end. I will say the new development analysis took a little bit longer than we thought, which is why we got the report to you very, very shortly before this meeting. So I'm into the part of the presentation now that wasn't part of the kickoff meeting, so I'll take a little more time with these. But just to kind of review some important parts with data collection, the 2019 LIDAR, Volusia County LIDAR, was a really important part of this project. It was really foundational for the analysis. And that was collected from December 4th, 2018 to March 22nd, 2019. And the kind of the newer versions of LIDAR are very, very detailed, detailed enough to support a 2.5-foot grid. So think of a point every 2.5 feet representing the ground.
What is LIDAR?
Oh, sorry. So LIDAR is light detection and ranging. So it's lasers mounted to a fixed-wing aircraft. They fly over, and they're able to detect the elevation of the ground and able to penetrate through a lot of vegetation. So it's really the modern way in which topography is done these days. You can collect, billions of points in a very short period of time, giving us resolution that we just have never had before topographically.
So the county had this information, Brent, and they funded the LIDAR study, and you've just used it. Is that right? LIDAR as an elevation detection device.
Yes, so it's actually, the program is actually nationwide. It's through USGS. It's implemented in our state through the Florida Division of Emergency Management, and they typically deliver the products countywide. So yeah, so when I say Volusia County, it's really just the geographic boundary.
Many of us in the crowd are not experts, so we're going to slow you down whenever we don't understand something.
Yeah.
You can ask, people need to know what exactly, as good as we can, understand what you're talking about.
Absolutely, more than welcome. Another important aspect for putting together this type of analysis, putting this type of model, is the soil. So what's typically used is called the USDA NRCS soil data set, SERGO data set. And it's just a GIS layer of all the soils. And we have all the characteristics of the different layers of soils all throughout the city. And that's, again, something that's very, very commonly used for this type of analysis. Some other important aspects, we need to have land cover and impervious mapping to feed into the model. So we had various sources, the 2014 St. Johns River Water Management District land cover mapping, the 2018 National Hydrography data set. We have building footprints statewide from Microsoft, and we developed our impervious mapping using some machine learning algorithms, but, you know, a very detailed, highly accurate layer of all the imperviousness in the city. So that kind of gives us a very good representation of what's on the land, and then we have to complement that with what's the infrastructure and what's under the ground. So the city provided us with over 11,000 structures, 11,000 points, and then we had almost 13,000 from Volusia County. So, and I'll show you how the study extended outside the city. One of the last pieces was applying the rainfall from Hurricane Ian, and we got that from NEXRAD, that stands for Next Generation Radar. So it's just a radar-derived rainfall as opposed to measured at a gauge. And again, that's typically very commonly used for when you do a study of this aerial extent. We compared the volumes from the NEXRAD pixels to the 4 gauges that I had showed previously, and they compared very favorably. Every once in a while, NEXRAD during a really large event can be fooled because it's not measuring rainfall directly, it's measuring reflectivity, and sometimes you'll get an answer that isn't as accurate, but we were comfortable that this was very accurate because of how well it measured or compared to the 4 gauges. And then the last piece that the model needed was the boundary stages. So we knew through observed high water marks how high the surge was, and then to put a time value to that, a time series to that, we had the recorded time series from the Trident gauge. That was the closest gauge that we had to put a time varying series to that.
Brett, before you go into the analysis,
Yes.
Question about the periodicity for which these reports of data like LIDAR, FEMA floodplain, what's typical? Like the LIDARs from 2019. How often do they do it? Why do they do it at that periodicity? Why don't they do it every year? What is our reasoning behind why they do it at the certain intervals they do? Some might wonder, hey, the last FEMA map is 5 years old. How current does it need to be? That type of, I'm just trying to get a feel
Sure.
for, is this I know it's the most current you got, but
Yes.
how good is it?
Yes. Good question, hard to answer because it's changing. So one of the good things is that because the technology is becoming so good and so many people are using it, the cost keeps coming down and coming down and coming down. When LIDAR was first used, it was expensive enough that you didn't typically fly something but maybe once every 10 years or so. The hope now is that it's going to be at a higher frequency. Now, what that frequency is going to depend on who's funding it and what the need for that is. We're hopeful that LIDAR flights are going to be maybe every 2-3 years throughout the state, but you can imagine. I mean, they flew the whole state, and that's pretty expensive to do that, and so there would have to be funding to do that. In terms of the FEMA updates, there really isn't, and historically has not been anything that's regular about that. It's somewhat community specific. It's somewhat dependent on how well FEMA gets funded, which varies, pretty substantially from year to year, and how much they have to put in.
Would you speculate about the periodicity?
I would say probably 10 years would probably be a typical periodicity.
Thank you.
Hopefully that was not more than what you wanted.
No, thank you.
So we put all those things together into a model that goes by the name of two-flow. So as Kyle said, it's a 2-dimensional model. So the flow is allowed to go whichever way it goes in a big event. And then we have all those one-dimensional elements. So all the storm sewers, all the control structures, all those things are also in the model. So what this figure is showing is in red, that's the city boundary. And then in blue, the kind of the dark blue outline, that's actually the extent of the model. And the reason that the model is so much bigger than city is because we have flow that comes from outside the city into the city, and then we have flow in the city that goes out, to one of our boundary conditions. And you can get a sense of the terrain. The color ramp is the whites are the highest elevations, the greens and blues are the lowest. So not surprisingly, you see we kind of go from west to east here elevation-wise. And then all the yellow is all the stormwater structures that we got from the city and the county. So very, an extensive amount that went into the model. Inside the city, we used 15-foot grid cells. So every 15 square feet, we were simulating the rainfall that was hitting that, flowing off and going somewhere else. And then outside the city, we used a 60-foot grid cell, which was accurate enough to get all the flows into and out of the city. So a very, very detailed model. Imagine a grid cell about the size of a travel lane. And on that, we simulated Hurricane Ian and then also the 100-year, 24-hour regulatory event. One of the things that was important, one of the things that's important to do in any type of analysis like this is to make sure that the model is matching reality. So again, we had the almost 1,350 points that were reported on from the citizens and staff. So we had the location of all those. So we were able, when we simulated Hurricane Ian, we were able to compare where the reported flooding was to where the modeled flooding was. And I'm zoomed out pretty far here, but we had an outstanding match between them. So we felt really good about the model verifying the known flooding. We only had a very, very limited number of points on the beach side where the model was a little under predicting on the flooding, probably because we might have over predicted the amount of soil storage there. But the vast, vast, vast majority of these were really what had been experienced. So we felt good about the model validation. Then we also ran the 100-year, 24-hour event, and then we used the FEMA surge on top of that. So we used the 100-year, 24-hour event for the rainfall, and then we used the FEMA surge to kind of see which of the two elevations was the highest throughout the city and map that all as the 100-year, kind of our 100-year stages.
So Brett, I can see the map, but I can't tell you what I'm looking at other than the red lines that you told me about.
Okay.
How do you know, you say it was a good match? Why don't you, for the audience, for all of us that are very interested, say again what your methodology was for determining that it was a good match? Is it what I'm looking at, or is it other things that you have that you know that we don't?
Yes, no, it's this. So the match was off this slide. So wherever there's a yellow dot, so wherever we had observed flooding, we would want the model to be predicting flooding. And I'll take a step back. So anywhere there's color on this map, so anywhere from a white to a blue, the lighter shades are shallower flooding, and the deeper blue it gets, the deeper the flood depth is. And so when we zoom in, we've got a little bit of a panel zoomed out there in the upper right corner. So when we zoom in, we see that the model was predicting flooding where all the observed flooding was.
Thank you. Helpful.
And then similarly, this is for the 100-year event. Anything that is colored, anything that's shaded, kind of a similar color ramp. So the lighter the shade, the lower the flood depth, and the deeper the shade, the higher the depth of flooding. So we had Hurricane Ian, we had the 100-year, and then we did a subtraction of those two. So we wanted to see what was the difference between the 100-year 24-hour, which is kind of typically what you're regulating to, versus what happened in Ian. Again, anything that is in color is where there was flooding in Ian in excess of the 100-year 24-hour. So this is a kind of a difference between those two. Anything that's a lighter shade is, maybe half a foot to a foot, and as you start getting into the deeper shades, it could be several feet different.
And to be clear, in excess of the 100-year.
Yes. So this is a delta. So this is the height, the feet that Ian flooded above the 100-year based on our model results.
So all the color shades show additional flooding above the 100-year flood, and the red line, remind me what the red lines are?
The
Let's
red
start
line
on
is
the
city boundary.
City boundary, okay, thanks.
Okay, may I ask if the PDFs that went out today are not as detailed as what we see up there? Because I'm seeing shading there that I'm not here, particularly where I live, which floods.
Okay, it's the same, I can tell you it's the same figure.
Okay.
It
I
may
can
just
see
be
it
because
better
it's
up
blown
there.
up.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. It
Yeah.
appears to be more detailed up there or in better coloration there than on the screen here.
Yes, and I should also mention that we'll be giving you all those results as GIS layers. So we're just trying to capture everything in one figure.
No,
Just-
that's fine.
yeah.
I was just, I was seeing slightly different results
Yeah.
here and there, so I was a little curious.
Yeah, it's a big area, and there's some, at this scale, there's some flooding that you really can't even see. But as you zoom in and zoom around, then it becomes a lot clearer. And we'll give that to you so that you're able to look at it in whatever location you want, at whatever scale you want.
Thank you.
So that was that portion of the modeling analysis. One of the questions that came up during the study was the effects of ditch maintenance. And there was a question about, do we need to do some additional analysis to see maybe what impact ditch maintenance had during the Hurricane Ian? So what we did was we sampled, with the results that you just saw from Hurricane Ian, we sampled 10 different ditch locations. And we looked at the ditch cross-section and then how big the floodplain was in and around that ditch. In all 10 cases, the overbank flow was so much more than what was in the ditch. I didn't feel it was good use of, I could have taken the money and done it and given you the answer that I already knew to begin with. So I felt like we had enough results to know that for Ian, it probably didn't make much of a difference. Now, caution that that's for Ian. For smaller events, I wouldn't necessarily come to that same conclusion. But with the results that I had for Ian, I don't think ditch maintenance, at least in the ones that I looked at, was much of a player.
I was just looking for you to clarify, I think you did in your last sentence. You said, what you're saying is that there was so much water that looking at what the ditches could hold was almost irrelevant because there was just so much more water than what the ditches could
That's correct.
retain and flush
Yeah.
out.
Yes, and so again, if I were to look at, say, a 10-year event or a 5-year event or something like that, I may not come to that conclusion. So that was specific to Hurricane Ian.
This is a pivotal point that Commissioner McGurk brings up. There are many who feel like our ditches were not maintained, were not as deep as they should have been, were not cleaned out, and so for this size storm, would have been great to have it, but it would not have changed the outcome, is your point. But for smaller storms, certainly, most storms, the ditches should work.
Yes, and again, that's based on I just kind of picked several at random, 10 at random throughout the city.
And these are, we call them canals. These are the canals that are around the city, yeah? Same
I
thing?
picked different sizes, so smaller ones and larger ones. I tried
Okay.
to kind of give a pretty representative sample.
Thank you.
Did that include the Pioneer Trail ditches, whatever you want to call them, depressions by the side of the road? How's that?
Yeah, a couple of the ditches that we sampled were pretty small, so maybe, on the order of 2-3 feet deep and maybe, 4 to 5 feet wide. So that was as smaller ones that we looked at. And I'm not familiar if we did specifically ones by Pioneer Trail, but
Kyle would be able to identify that when he does the analysis. Thank you.
okay.
Okay, you opened it up, though. Okay, you looked at small ditches. You look at any of our big ditches?
Yes.
Okay. Same
So-
result.
so, yeah, same conclusion. So, I'm remiss. I probably should have put a cross section up here, but imagine. how do I even do this? Imagine that this is the ditch and the floodplain is maybe like this.
Got it.
So it's just, your common sense would tell you that for that particular event, it wasn't going to make much difference.
Thank you, appreciate that clarity, Brent.
Okay. So one of the other questions that we wanted to answer in this is new development. So what are new developments that are being applied to your newer standards, are those having an impact? And I'll get into your standards after I do this, but what we did here, we were pointed to the Venetian Bay area and the coastal woods area, and I kind of refer to these generally, and what we did do was took those back to pre-development conditions. So we already had a model that had them in post-development conditions. We took these two areas that were outlined back to pre-development conditions, and the areas that are outlined, that's really where we had kind of good, reliable pre-development topographic data. So that's really why these areas were picked or zeroed in on. So then we compared the peak stages from Hurricane Ian from the model that we had already developed for post-development conditions to the pre-development conditions. And in these two locations, we did not detect any significant differences. So we were looking particularly outside the developments, but even, within. But that for these two that we analyzed, that it looks like for Ian that either the controls are working or it wouldn't have made a difference. So whatever conclusion you want to come to, but we did not detect any difference pre and post in those.
Hold on a second. Let me slow you down.
Yes.
This is the details that I think we and everybody want to hear, and I want to
Okay.
make sure you understand it at a level. We're going to bring that down a little
Okay.
bit and have you restate that. Try to restate that in layman's terms, what you just said about Venetian Bay and coastal woods.
Okay, so you can see these two developments here. You can see that there's homes, there's roads, there's stormwater ponds. They have been developed, and they have been developed in a way that is providing some level of control to the stormwater discharge, presumably to the city's standards. So we had that condition already built into the model that I previously presented to you. So then we took these same two areas, the areas that are in these two outlines, and just took the developments out completely. We took away the homes, we took away the grading, we took away the stormwater ponds, we took everything back to what it was before there was a development. And then just for those portions, and then simulated Ian again. Same storm, but different hydrologic conditions.
So you took out the development
Yes,
to determine what the water impact would have been without the development
correct.
in the surrounding area.
Yes.
And the answer to that is what?
Well, no significant difference. So what we had intended to do was to show you a grid, to show you a grid of differences, and we didn't have differences to show. So I don't, it's kind of a non-result, if you will. There was no significant change in the flood stages for Ian outside those two polygons.
So I know Venetian Bay was underwater, parts of it for several days, truly became Venice, right?
Yes.
So if Venetian Bay did not exist, where would that water have gone? I mean, because it took a while for it to drain out of Venetian Bay, and that amount of time there, that amount of water there, still had no significant impact, meaning without the development, that area would have been similarly underwater. I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
And it would not have taken water from other areas that did flood at all?
So the way that we set the model up, if it was taking any water in the pre-development conditions, so before Venetian Bay, before this portion of Venetian Bay was built, if it was taking any water from outside Venetian Bay, the model was allowing it to do that. So if there was any flow, and I'm pretty certain there was flow on the, kind of on the southwest corner that came into there under pre-development conditions. So any grading, anything that existed, any flow that could happen under pre-development conditions, the model was simulating that. It was accounting for that.
Okay.
Brett, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to lead the duck a little bit here. Both Commissioner Martin and Commissioner McGurk are getting to something that the crowd really wants to hear about. I don't want to put, and you let me know if this is not what you're saying. Are you
Okay.
saying that the drainage would have been the same in those contained areas, either flow in or flow out, regardless of whether the structures were there or not?
I'm saying, I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. What I'm saying is that outside of Venetian Bay, so outside of these areas,
Right.
what happened to the stages in Hurricane Ian would have been the same before or after development.
Okay.
So
What I'm hearing is you saying that those areas outside of Venetian Bay and coastal woods would have flooded about the same amount,
yes,
whether or not those developments had been made.
that's what I'm saying, yes.
Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you for the rephrasing. So that was the new development analysis. Then one of the other things that we did was reviewed your stormwater standards. And I'll say, kind of getting to the punchline, you have outstanding stormwater standards. Whoever developed your standards really knew what they were doing. I've looked at easily in excess of 50 stormwater standards in Florida, probably over 100. And these are among the best that I've seen. And I'll explain
I
why.
So
suspect
Brett,
you
say
could
some
take
more,
it
sorry,
off the
sorry,
top.
Lisa, hang on just a second, let's not get ahead of ourselves. If you will educate us to what that means in layman's terms, that'll help a lot, because
Yes.
people hear the word, we have great stormwater control. If you'll help us all understand what that means, and, you know, I've seen them all over the state, and this is the best storm, okay,
Yeah.
tell us some more about that in
Yes.
specifics, because the city is responsible for that, and we want to make sure we're good stewards of that, and if we're not, we'd like to know it, and if we are, we'd like to understand why it's so good. Tell us
Yes.
why it's so good.
All right, you set me up perfectly here. So from right at the beginning, you, like with any other community, you're in conformance with the St. Johns River Water Management District rule. So that's the Florida Administrative Code 40C42. So you can't do anything that's less restrictive or less protective than theirs, which you don't. But you control, here are some things that are not common or in some cases very uncommon. So you control flows to the 100-year storm in most cases. There's a few that you maybe don't, but for most situations you control the 100-year storm. A lot of other communities, some other communities only control to the 25-year storm. You control to the 100, and that's good.
Brett, I'm going to ask you clarify that you don't mean that a storm happens only every 100 years, but that we have a 1 in 100 chance every year of having that storm.
That's correct.
Which
Yes.
I just want to make
Yes.
sure that the audience understands that.
Yes, and maybe I should, in some ways, the 100-year storm it can mislead people. It's exactly a better way to think, there's a couple ways to think of it. It can mean that you, on a very long-term average, so think maybe thousands of years, on that average, you have a storm, or you have a storm on average that equals or exceeds that about once every 100 years. A better way to think of it, I think, is the way that you just phrased it, and it's just a different way of restating it, is that any given year you have a 1% chance of having that storm. So if you had, and that means if this year you had a 100-year storm, next year you'd have the exact same chance. Even though you just had the 100-year storm, it kind of resets every year, just the way it works. So for compensating storage, a typical compensating storage rule is 1-to-1, or they call it cup for cup. You have 1.5 to 1. So that's more protective than what you typically see almost anywhere. So that's a higher standard. you control the 25-year storm event to 90% of the pre-development, and that's a great standard, and I rarely see that one. So a typical standard around the state would be controlling to 100%, not to 90%. You control to 100%. So that's good and uncommon. You have wetland protections, which are good, and then you have a number of provisions for protecting your finished floor elevations. Now that's obviously only going to help for the new buildings, but at least there's that.
Yeah, linger there for a minute, please. That means that any new construction will have to meet those requirements. Homes that were built a long, long time ago, they do not have the same level of protection because they weren't built to these standards.
That's correct. Yes.
And
Yeah,
Brett,
and
if you
it's-
don't mind, just in layman terms, if you could explain the compensating storage 1.5 times the fill, so just explain that to the public.
Yes, so when you are going to develop a property or a site and you're going to fill in the 100-year floodplain, that can be allowed as long as you compensate for it. So if you fill in here but dig out here, you haven't really changed the storage, then that's allowable. Your requirement is even more stringent than that. So if you fill somewhere in that 100-year floodplain, whatever you filled, you have to dig out, you have to create storage 1.5 times what you filled. So very, very protective, and that's
Measured
very uncommon to
citywide,
see that.
Gret, sorry for interrupting, measured citywide or development by development?
Development by development.
But it's citywide, and it's an
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Kyle?
So-
Every site plan, every development within the city that triggers that threshold, yes.
Does that happen on a single household basis?
No, that happens on properties that trigger the size of the project. So it's typically, it has to be a minimum 1 acre. So
Okay, so
it's not
anything,
small, little infill developments.
yeah, I was gonna ask, and what is the standard for those infill, for the less than 1 acre? In other words, if I put 10 individual houses on an acre and none of them need to match that, what happens?
Well, I'd like to see that zoning that gives you 10 homes. But no, if it's less than that, they have to go through the typical standard of the 1-to-1. The more stringent is the larger impacts to the community.
Okay. So individual houses or infill is a 1-for-1, developments over an acre are 1.5.
Correct.
Thank you.
And one last question on that. Approximately, when did we start requiring developments to have that 1.5 times compensation storage?
It was about just over a year ago.
Okay. So what was the compensating storage previously?
1-to-1.
It was a cup for cup, like Brett explained, 1-for-1,
Okay.
typical standard procedures.
Okay. So previously, we were at what the standard was, and then approximately a year ago, we went to a roughly 50% increase on that 1.5 times.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And
Okay.
going back to that 1-for-1, approximately how long has that been in place? Give me just a ballpark idea.
Boy, it's been over 20 years, put it that way.
I
Could
would
I-
So
say
most
from
of the new development, Venetian Bay, Coastal Woods, the larger ones,
1-to-1.
have been built to 1-to-1.
Correct.
And those going forward are gonna be built 1.5 to 1.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we do not have any new developments finished yet at 1.5. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
So, kind of going back to what Khalid had said previously, what we kind of consider to be modern stormwater management, that started or modern stormwater management regulations, that came about in, say, the mid-'80s. It was a little different in different parts of the state, but that anything kind of from mid-'80s on is more of the modern era, maybe similar things to what you see here. And then the city has then taken that up another level.
And one for one, Commissioner McGurk, if I'm not mistaken, it was in the early 90s that the city has implemented that requirement. But most of cities that I'm aware of in the state of Florida, I would say the majority of them, they use 1-for-1. Unless if you know of any other cities that they have changed.
1-for-1 is very common, yeah. I know of, I'm not sure if I know anyone else that's at 1.5 to 1. Not to say that there isn't, but I'm just not familiar with them. So those are, you asked, things that are good. Those are things that are good and make your rules more protective now. But the best can always get better. So I've given you some things, potential improvements, things to think about. Not saying that you would have to implement all these, but these are just some things that to consider. Commissioner Martin, you asked about single family, and some of what I was giving you, there's some exemptions for, which is typical. There's exemptions for smaller properties. So you might want to look at what those thresholds are, particularly for some of the non-residential. It may be okay, but just something else to look at. I pointed this out in the report. There is some clarification for some of the language. Not that the language itself, or not that the standard itself needs to change, but some of the there's some clarity that could be added to a few parts of the language. Even though you implement this already, from my understanding, it would be better to have a standard for safe conveyance of off-site flows. So kind of going back to your Venetian Bay example, a standard that says if historically flow is going across this property when you develop it, you have to safely convey it. Another one, even though you have some really good requirements for finished floor elevations, you're now going to be doing, well, let me even take a step back. You have some good requirements in there because we know that with coastal surges getting higher, with rainfalls getting higher, we know that our flood stages are probably going to be increasing. So you have some provisions in there that really kind of allow for doing something higher than the minimum. And those are really kind of best guesses or best estimates, but you're going to be doing the vulnerability assessment now, and in that you're required to look at the 2040 and 2070 conditions. So you might be able to get, particularly with the 2070, you might be able to get some information from there where you might even further refine those finished floor elevation requirements once that study is done. And then another one to look at is controlling the 100-year storm event in all instances. You do in most instances, but maybe controlling to all. So those were just some general things that I saw that you could consider. And then beyond just the code and the standards, I have some general recommendations for you, and these are generally ranked in potential effectiveness, kind of the most effective to, I hate to say least effective, but, ones that maybe you're going to get a little less bang for the buck for. Because of the time and because of the flooding that you've experienced and so forth, you really need to do a stormwater master plan update. I found out recently that you actually, the wheels are in motion for that. So that's really good. This funding will kickstart that, and there's a lot of information that you can take from this that can lead directly into the master plan update. What this study didn't do is to go into an alternatives analysis. So we don't have anything in there that says, well, you need to do these 20 things to relieve flooding here or there. The stormwater master plan update will do that, and then you can really start to prioritize what projects can be done, how those are funded, and so forth. So that's really an important next step that I would recommend. Once you do that, once you have a good model of the whole city, then you can switch to what is called demonstrative criteria. What you have now is called presumptive criteria, and what you have is really good presumptive criteria. But for instance, when you control the post-development peak flow to 90% of the pre-development peak flow, you're presuming that you're controlling downstream stages. So that's why it's called a presumptive criterion. With demonstrative criteria, you would then have to build the proposed development into your watershed model and demonstrate that it doesn't have downstream stages. So a number of communities are going to that, but that really is predicated on having made the initial investment in that citywide model, which you would be doing through your stormwater master plan update.
So may I, just to understand, you know, if in essence there is a downstream dam, we're going to have increased flooding, right? If where we expect our water to flow away to is somehow, whether it's dammed, whatever we want to call it, we can't, the water is not flowing as easily downstream as we would expect it, we would have upstream more flooding, yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but that's not what this is gonna do for you.
Okay.
So in other words, instead of as your development community comes in and designs the grading plan, sizes the stormwater structure, they're sizing it to presumptive criteria. So they're using the cup for cup or
Yeah.
1.5 to 1. They're controlling the peak flow to 90%. Those are again are presumptive criteria. So if they're presuming, or we're presuming that if you do all those things, that downstream of that or even upstream of you, that you're not going to increase flooding. You're not going to increase flooding to your neighbor. So that development isn't going to adversely impact or increase flood stages beyond their property. And that's the way that it's typically done. With demonstrative criteria, they would have to build their proposed development and all the stormwater structure into your city model and then demonstrate that outside their development, they're not raising stages.
That's where I was looking
Yeah.
at, yeah.
And there are other communities that do that, and typically they'll put a limit on it, so they may, Sarasota County is one, and I think it's something like 8 acres of imperviousness or 35 acres. So any development that's larger than that, you would have to build your proposed development into their model and demonstrate that it doesn't have adverse impacts.
Thank you.
And something else which may be helpful is evaluating whether it's worth improving your community rating system, your CRS class. So you're currently a 5, which is kind of typical in Florida. Once you get to a 5, and I'm sure you've had to work to get to a 5, it gets increasingly harder. So there are prerequisites that you have to do to get to a 4. Some of those prerequisites, you can get the points that you need when you do a stormwater master plan. So if you do your master plan update, that may kind of walk you towards getting to a 4. The more you do for your CRS, the more you've done to make your community more resilient to flooding, and then it also gives an additional 5% discount. So,
Yes.
but you have to figure out
Hey,
if the
flood
juice is worth the
insurance is
squeeze.
going up fast, so every percentage that you can knock off, that's much appreciated.
Yes. And then the final one goes back to the topic that we had talked about before, which is ditch maintenance. So what I don't have in here, I should have put that in here, is it looks like you may not have easements, or at least not have a record of easements that you need for all the ditches. So that's one thing that we would typically recommend, is make sure that you have all your easements and that they're mapped. That would be the first thing. The second thing would be to use what's called a computerized maintenance management system. So that's just something that keeps track of scheduling maintenance for the ditches, scheduling the inspections, and then if there's any clean out that needs to be done. The final piece, which can get a little tricky because of the age of some of your ditches, is establishing the original cross sections. So you'll at some point, if you're going to want to bring them back to the original design conditions, you'll have to track that down, and that's, given the age of some of them, that's going to be no small feat. And then finally, I have conclusions for the moratorium. So I'll say that if I understand the purpose of the moratorium, I don't think that you need to continue the moratorium, my opinion, The reason I say that is really the things I've listed here. So your stormwater code and standards, I'm confident in saying they're among the most protective in the state. Many of the parcels that you have, particularly the ones that were impacted, were prior to modern stormwater management and your current stormwater regulations, and they're in the 100-year floodplain or special flood hazard area. And Ian was well in excess, if you saw, Ian was well in excess of that 100-year storm. And it also had, of course, the high coastal surge, so really the worst of all possibilities. And then finally, and this really kind of goes back to doing the stormwater update. I mean, you see the magnitude of the problems. It's going to take a significant investment to really be able to address some of these. First, to find out if there's even a feasible solution, and then one that's both feasible and permittable. Again, that's part of the stormwater master planning. And in some cases, you'll probably be left with having to raise the elevations.
Yeah, my question was going to be, is there a sort of a cost-benefit analysis? In other words, it's a lot of money to do this, but if we save even more at the next event, isn't that a good return on investment?
Yeah, so typically that type of study has a very high return on investment. So whatever the cost that it takes to do it, the savings that you get in property damage, inconvenience, you know, all the things that, all the benefits that come with it. Typically, it's many-fold.
Thank you.
And I believe that is the last slide. Yeah.
So Mayor, I got a couple questions.
Yep, go right ahead. Commissioner McGurk?
So bear with me here. I'm gonna try to articulate this as easy as possible, kind of summarize. Our topography, as I understand, flows from west to east, and our stormwater drains essentially into the Indian River and out the ocean, theoretically.
Yes.
Okay. In this specific incident, Hurricane Ian, we had two major problems, as I understand. One was tidal surge that pushed the ocean waters or intercoastal waters up into the creeks, tidal creeks.
Yes.
Which are the same creeks that are supposed to allow the rainwater that comes down to flush out through these creeks going the other way. And they couldn't do that. So we had 20 inches of rain, and we had a storm surge. So we had an incredibly high rate of rainfall that the system wasn't designed to cover. We also had nowhere for the rainwater to go because the tidal surges were pushing against the rainwater trying to get out to the intercoastal.
That's correct.
Okay. What can we do to prevent, is there anything we can do to prevent another incident like Ian? In Ian's case, it was roughly 20 inches of rain, whether it's the 500 or 1,000-year storm event. With our topography, how we're set up, is there what can we do, if anything, to prevent that from happening?
Good question. There's going to be parts of the areas where you're closer to the coast, where you're closer to where the tidal surge is. The closer you are to those areas, the harder it's going to be to come up with something feasible. If you have another Ian, really for the reasons that you described, there's nowhere for the water to go. And you really had the worst of both worlds because the surge was coincident timing-wise when all the water from the 20 inches was wanting to get out. So that's as bad a condition as you can get. Those areas are going to be more difficult just because there's not a lot that can be done easily. I think the further up the hill you get, you're probably going to tend to find more feasible solutions and ones that are more permittable. And I'm not we didn't get into alternatives analysis, so I'm not saying that there isn't anything at all that could be done. But just in general, it's going to be more challenging as you get into the lower elevations.
Can we take an old community like this that was, the older developments are built somewhere between 4 and 6 foot above the grade, and retrofit this, or how do you take those low-lying properties and protect them from something above the 100-year flood? Is that possible?
It may be possible. Now, whether it's affordable is another question. If in some areas you might be, and again, I'm kind of answering you generally, and this would be very case specific to the flooding in each location. But just to kind of give you an example of what other communities may have to do or have done, some of them may be bad enough that you're just going to have to, you wouldn't have much of many other alternatives other than to, if you wanted to keep the homes there, to build a berm around it and pump. That's kind of the drastic measure that you may have to go to.
So this is like creating dikes
Yep.
like Lake Okeechobee, or creating
Yes.
bowls like New Orleans.
That would be kind of more the extreme case. That might be what you have to go to, or you would have to elevate the finished floors. There's going to be other instances where you're not going to likely not have to go to something that extreme. So there might be bottlenecks. There might be that you can relieve. There might be more conveyance. There might be more storage that could be done. But again, we didn't get into alternatives in this study.
Well, I appreciate your report, and thank you for your time. And
Any
I'll-
other questions,
Yeah.
Commissioner McGurk?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Okay, very good. Commissioner Martin, go ahead.
And this may be more for Kyle, but I'm thinking of, in Irma, we had full moon, high tide, storm surge. And of course, I'm wondering, after listening to Brett's explanation, if while the rain was different, if the final result in many ways was the same. Not to the same extent that it was in Ian, but isn't that a similar thing where the storm surge, high tide, the whole, what was it, a king tide? The whole confluence of elements prevented the drainage that normally would have occurred into the ocean?
Yeah, it was. I mean, we can throw northeasterly and everything in there. That was 2017 for Irma, and just as Brett explained, the closer you got to that discharge water body,
Yeah.
the higher the odds were that the homes or development was going to realize some flooding, or the higher surge elevations. So yes, it was very similar. It just wasn't of the same magnitude.
Yeah.
And it didn't, the grade, the hydraulic grade line, whatever it was, did not go all the way through the Turnbull Canal.
So I guess what I'm saying is that we may call it a 1% chance, but it's happened out here twice in the last 5 years. Different extent, but nevertheless.
Oh, I agree. We've had, we're in the HMGP projects, and those homes flooded 3 or 4 times since 2017.
Thanks. Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Martin?
I think I'm good.
Okay, good. Just for clarification, backing up on what Commissioner McGurk was talking about, storm surge measured in feet,
Yes.
how many?
It was 6 or 7 feet reference
So
to.
6 or 7 feet just in storm surge.
Yeah, and that's in reference to the standard vertical datum. So the NAVD 88 is.
Thank you, thank you. Would just with storm surge, no rain, just say storm surge, what would that have made our canals look like?
I had a figure on that earlier so that.
I could tell you, Mayor, in Hurricane Nicole, we kept getting reports that you will have a 4-foot surge. So I went to the DEP model map, and I put there the 4-foot surge. And I could tell you this, right after the hurricane, I went out, and I would say probably it was 85 to 90% accurate. In one area in particular that I went out there just to compare between what happened in Ian and Nicole was the Pine Island. So when I put the 4-foot surge on the DEP map for Nicole, without the rain, the roads were flooded, but no homes flooded. Similarly, in other areas, so if you put the surge without the rain, a 4-foot surge, you will see that in areas that will flood, and areas that the streets will flood. Now, our stormwater master plan allows the water to be in the roads probably, what is it, less than 72 hours, Kyle?
So
So
say that
that's-
again, Colin.
It-
Our design is for it to be in the roads for up to 72 hours.
Less than, yeah, up to 72 hours. And that's just to be on the road, not to flood the homes. But that was the way the stormwater master plan was designed. It was to have the water on the road for up to 72 hours. But these the flood maps that they're showing, the model maps, I could tell you, they're very accurate. And that's why in Nicole, we sent out 1,500 notices to homes that we thought that they might be impacted, based on this model map.
Great, I appreciate that. The drama there is that storm surge alone is deadly and dangerous, and add on top of that this unimaginable amount of 21 inches we got with Ian. You had what we had, and that's why it's a 1 in 100%, 100 chance of that happening year
Yes.
over year. Any follow-up by any of the commission? Mr. Cunningham, thank you so very much for what you have presented. I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you.
Chief Engineer Fegley, thank you for the partnership. I understand there's a very long report that goes along with this short PowerPoint with many more details, and the city staff will be pouring through those over the next several weeks. Is that right?
Yes, and Mayor also, he mentioned in one of his recommendations about the action plan, and that is supposed to be provided by the city staff. Tonight, we were asking the commission for a motion, but I think you guys will do that, and we'll come back to you probably in a month or so with an action plan based on the recommendation that he did. I think there's a couple of recommendations that we're already working on. The community rating system that he's actually asking for us to explore the idea of lowering our class. Right now, we're class 5. And I think Jesse is here, and I think we'll look into that to see what would it take. Now, if you wanted to lower the class, which you lower your the flood insurance premium, number one. Number two, it would actually be costly in terms of the construction. So we'll come back with an action plan and give you the pros and cons and everything that we will recommend for you, including cost.
Really good, and I think that it would be good to have our colleagues who are not here have time as well to digest this information before we made any particular motion. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And so now we'll open this to the public participation portion. You'll have 3 minutes to make your comment. Come forward to the microphone, please. And we will give you 3 minutes. If you happen to have a question, please ask it at the end. It will terminate your 3 minutes, and you'll get one question to ask our expert. Yes, ma'am, and name and address, please, as you come forward.
Marvel Richards, 1099 Clubhouse Boulevard. Well, one of my questions, I'm sorry, no questions, but he skipped over the wetlands on the slide.
Speak right into that microphone, Marvel.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Wait a minute,
I'm right
Brett,
at it.
perhaps that microphone might work better. Marvel, here it comes.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. He skipped over a couple things on one of the slides, and one was to do with the wetlands. So I would hopefully like him to come back and address that.
Certainly.
And then the other thing, and this is, it's very hard. I understand about the storm surge and the 20 inches of rain and all of that, but I find it very, very hard to intellectually comprehend that you take down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of trees that are wetlands, and it has no impact. It has to have an impact, my opinion.
Thank you very much. Order, please, and we won't be able to do the applause and boos, folks, just like you always do at our commission meetings. Please let the people speak, and we understand that there's a lot of passion and a lot of energy behind that, and some of the stuff is unbelievable and hard to comprehend and doesn't feel right. So that's why we brought an expert and an engineer. Mr. Cunningham, would you like to respond to the wetland piece, and then we'll move on to the next question?
Don't do that to me. Yeah, I had a bullet up there on wetlands. So the wetlands, there's wetland protections through DEP and water management district rules, and then in addition to that, the city has some protective language for wetlands in their code. So that's really all that bullet was intended to convey.
But we do allow wetlands to be filled in for development.
But that's where the mitigation comes.
Yes, sir.
I'm not a tree hugger, so. Anyway, Steve Stawicki, I live at 1383 Tumbling Drive. The day of the storm, I was able to go out right afterwards, and I was standing on the new bridge on Turnbull Bay Road. And one thing I'd like to have you take into consideration, when I look back westward, and I was standing on the bridge on Turnbull Bay Road, I'm looking at the railroad tracks and the railroad trestle. All the water from Turnbull Creek has to go through that little opening in the trestle.
Microphone, please.
Lots of help in the room here, sir. Just put your mouth
He
up
knows
to
what I'm
the
talking
microphone so everybody can hear you.
Anyway, like I said, all the water coming through that trestle was about 1.5 to 2 foot higher than it was coming on the Turnbull Bay Bridge, which, in other words, the railroad is like a dam. It was holding back the water. Was that taken into consideration in your study?
Yeah, so that was taken into consideration. So any culverts, storm sewers, control structures, anything like that that we had, that's all in the model. And I would say further that that's where a stormwater master plan can help with that. And the results from this study can help the stormwater master plan.
That opening isn't able to handle the water that was coming at it.
So,
Right.
sir, let's let him answer the question, and then no rebuttal, if you don't mind, please, sir.
And those observations are actually very helpful. So those are the types of things that we look for when coming up with feasible solutions, because that's a fairly simple fix. Now, what you can't do is open it up and create more problem for people downstream. So there would probably have to be things in addition to that. But in which case that probably would be okay. But those are the types of things that we would look for, that you would look for as you go through your coming up with feasible solutions, or where are your bottlenecks, where can you get a lot of relief without a massive investment.
So what you're saying is it's something to look at.
Absolutely something to look at, yes.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Bob Gattinella, 2815 South Oceano Court, New Smyrna Beach. I've been here in 40 years. I built a home in Venezia and never flooded. When the water went over, I got scared. I moved to the west for protection to Venetian Bay. It didn't work. I flooded, and my wife will never let me live that down. Okay, so my comment is this. One of the drains was not working, and the other was working off and on, off and on. Talking to other residents, they said they were alternating the drainage. My suggestion would be if we could get permission from the water people and the St. Johns River Water Management to drain, because we drain to retention ponds. And the retention ponds are basically all full most of the time. why can we not get permission to drain a little more water to the retention ponds earlier on in the season right now, so that when a storm comes, the retention ponds would be 2 or 3 inches lower, nobody downstream would be affected? I think we need permission from the St. John's Water Management people. And if we could do that, we could protect everybody in Venetian Bay and not affect other communities and give us a little more capacity. And that would be my suggestion if that could be done.
Perfect.
Could
Thank
we
you
ask
very much,
Kyle?
sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marie Corba. I live in Timber Trace. Thank you for everything that you've done. As a stormwater management expert, I am curious about the comment that was made about trees. Surely they absorb more water than sod. And I just wanted to know, you evaluate everything based on numbers, and if you've ever looked into that, what your opinion about that is, or what the answer is. Because a lot of the communities do take down most of the trees and then plant one tree in the yard of each home. But my other concern and question is about single-family homes. Where is the stormwater management for single-family homes? Homes that are new are being built to a certain flood elevation or finished floor elevation. But what about stormwater management on that property? Because if they're high and their neighbors are low, the water's going to go into the neighbor's yard, into the street, and we have plenty of single-family homes in the city. So it seems to me that the communities are doing their stormwater management according to codes, according to the South Florida Water Management District standards, but what about the single-family properties? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
That's a good question.
That's a good one.
Kyle.
I can see the chief engineer making his way.
Sure, the single-family homes, the Water Management District does not govern single-family homes. They don't get involved until a certain threshold. Usually it's above and beyond a quadplex. So if we're talking about infill, a lot of that happens on beachside. You see them knock down an old home and they'll build one a lot larger to maximize the impervious area. They are still governed by our land development regulations, and it's a simple volume calculation, so they have to provide 1.5 inches of retention on site over all the impervious surface. So whether that be roof line, sidewalk, driveway, that has to be retained on site, and then it has to discharge toward the city. It's not supposed to discharge to adjacent properties. So that may be something we look at with upgrading our code, because that's nominal amount, but it's certainly not like the pre and post development criteria that we talked about larger subdivisions.
And Kyle, also to add to it, I wanted to look at the single family in addition to the bigger project, exactly for what you just said. So we'll be looking at it to see what could we do to improve the situation, whether we increase the 1.5 inches to 3 inches, and also in terms of the runoff and the type of system that they use on the single family, especially when it's an infill lot. So I want to do that.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Cunningham on the tree question, please.
Yeah, so I think your question was, are trees accounted for, if they're taken down? Was that the essence of the question?
There are lots of communities that, when they're developed, they go in and they clear cut,
Yes.
and then when they develop that property, they lay down sod. But there are no trees, which I assume would suck up more water than St. Augustine grass. So is that accounted for numerically in the calculations?
Honestly, not that much. So trees, you can account for a little bit of leaf interception, but typically if you're going through a permit through the Water Management District, that's not something that they would necessarily consider. In other words, they wouldn't necessarily credit that. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. I will say for the types of events that are regulated, so 25-year event, 100-year event, that probably has less of an impact because there's so much rain. Where that's going to have more of an impact is more on an annual water budget, and then you get all the non-stormwater benefits that come with it. So heat island effect, those types of things. But just from a purely flood protection perspective, it's just not something that's considered all that much, to be honest.
Next up, please.
He could use the mic. Use the fan.
Yeah, okay. Luke Webb, 640 South Pine Street, right there by Norwoods.
Thanks, Luke.
We had these new storm drains put in a few years ago. And what's happening is you have your high tide surge, and there's check valves put in to supposedly stop it. So when them check valves are closed from the high tide, stormwater stops. The city purchased several homes on Goodwin and South Pine Street, and we were told meetings 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we've been going to meetings, me and my wife, for years, that we were going to have retention ponds put in them areas. The one on South Pine Street, because when the check valves close, stormwater starts coming up out of the drains. And the one house that was purchased, 632 South Pine Street, if that empty lot was dug out and put a retention pond there, that would relieve everybody to the south. And then there's also a house that was bought and tore down on Goodwin. They were promised a retention pond there also, and it never happened. So anything like that, digging, like that one gentleman said about digging out retention ponds and making, me and my wife shop vac for 4 hours in the hurricane, and time is of the essence, so any retention pond deeper or any added retention ponds would help time-wise, because once the tide goes out, we're safe again. Everybody can agree with that, so any time, would help as far as the retention
I
pond.
think I understand your question. City Manager, please.
Because I know specifically what he's talking about. I did the purchasing for that house. So the
Yes.
house the water was coming from underneath. And the reason that you couldn't see it lower, it's because of the water table. So when we dug it up, we couldn't go more than 6 inches or a foot. That's why you don't see it all the way down, because the water table gets so high and it gets wet.
Right.
So,
Well, I dug fence in my backyard. I hit water 18 to 24 inches, but the land on that property is higher than the road, so the road stays covered when there's a storm. Right there by the church, it stays covered. If that was dug out even a foot lower than the road, more water would stay there instead of going into my house.
yeah, we tried when we purchased, when we demolished the house. We tried.
I was
What
there.
happened is the water was there. So then people were saying you're gonna have mosquitoes because it's the water table goes up and down. So that's why I don't think it would really make any impacts if it was lower.
Well,
But
I
we'll look
disagree
into
with
it.
that, but even, I don't know. I talked with Lisa about gardens, like plant something there, I don't know.
The rain garden.
Rain garden, anything would help
Okay.
for houses down below us. All right, thank you.
Thank you for the time, sir. Appreciate your comments. So is the microphone working now, Phil, at the podium? Please take the handheld back, Kyle. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Hi. So my name is Corey Kish. We lived at 1225 Wayne Avenue for 14 years, and we had 19 inches of water in our home while we were home with our 2 young children and 2 dogs. So this was really terrible, obviously. But I appreciate you doing the development comparison with or without the 2 neighborhoods, but I didn't see anything about business development in your report, and I wasn't sure if businesses, specifically things like Tractor Supply, affecting Corbin Park, or other large-scale businesses, the 7-Eleven going in, things like that were also wetlands, if that was studied for a potential impact.
That's good. That's a good question, probably for you, Mr. Cunningham.
No, so we had a fairly limited amount of time to do this, and we wanted to be done before the moratorium was done and so forth. And I can tell you that was the most time-consuming part of the study. It takes a lot to do the research to bring it back to pre-development conditions. So we had just settled on we would do 2 developments. Those just happened to be the 2 that were selected. You could do it for more, but those are just the 2 that we did. So we did not do any that were business related.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I did also have another question
Go ahead, ma'am.
as well.
You've got 2 minutes left, all yours.
Woo. Will there be a list in the report of which ditches you measured in your, the 10, you said you selected 10 random ones?
Yes.
Will there be a list of their locations?
There's not currently, but we can make that available.
Yeah, I know that the only reason I bring that up is because we have since sold that residence because I'm not going through that again. As much as everyone says it's a 500-year event, whatever. We moved, and so I know, Mr. Manager, that you had discussed also dredging Pine Island, and that was approved. We were waiting on funding, and so does his report change your decision to pursue that project?
No, it does not. We did apply with the state for the dredging and the cleanup of the canal, and we were approved, but still the budget has to be approved by the governor, so, but it's not gonna change anything in terms of this report. We are moving forward with that one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you
all
so much for your
doing
questions.
doing the
Appreciate
work.
that,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Bill Wilson, 21 Andrea Drive, which is part of the Fairgreen development. And I don't really have a question per se, it's more of a request for sharing information when everything is said and done as far as the report. That Fairgreen area was all developed in the 70s and 80s, and so a lot of the criteria that exist today didn't exist then. That whole area, there's a series of retention ponds that are interconnected by piping that goes underneath city streets. So at the end, we'd like to have an understanding of what the original capacity was for those retention ponds and piping to deliver the water out of the neighborhood, and what the condition of those are today. And that's basically all we're seeking, is just some information so we can understand and communicate to all the homeowners there, because there's at least 8 homeowners associations there. So we can tell the people there that, you know, if we get a storm, let's say it's going to be 8 inches, we have the capacity to handle that. If it's 12 inches, no. So that's all I'm seeking. So thank you. Thank you for this effort.
Really good. Thank you so much, sir. The city manager will be in touch for sure. You need any information, Colin?
Mayor, I just want to, since she was talking about cleaning and dredging of the canal, and I just want to recognize House Representative Chase Tremont in the audience. Just want to thank him, and also Senator Tom Wright for helping us to get the $1 million for the cleanup and the dredging. So,
Really good. Thank you.
he's back there.
Thank you, Chase. Yes, sir.
Yeah, but I live up in Venetian Bay, and I moved here from California, and the stormwater drainage standards are a little different there. And, you know, hundreds of square miles get flooded from rainfall. Now, I had two
Sir, just for the record, your name and address?
Eric Bolstad. And then, question, I'm asked 2 questions, if you'd wait till the end to answer them. You know, there was statistical probability in a storm would come in off the Pacific Ocean, and we had to design for the 10 and 25-year storm. It was a waste of taxpayers' money to design for a 100-year or 500-year storm. Now here you have a couple things. You have a storm surge, which maybe is due to, you can tell me whether it's due to where the moon is, but we have our king tides and whatever. So we have our tides, a statistical probability that the tide is going to happen. At the same time, we have rain. Now there we have rain with a huge storm. Here you got hurricane, and there's a statistical probability, and maybe about 9 years ago, I've only been here 6 years, but 9 years ago you had a hurricane. You know, the 2 hurricanes crossed each other, and now here 2 hurricanes cross each other. And so they're kind of different statistic probabilities, than storms. Because what's the statistical probability of a king tide and statistical probability of a hurricane path? Because the last time I came down and talked to the city engineer, he said, Venetian Bay, you're up on a mountain at elevation 29. Well, the mountain got flooded because all we have is a little ditch that runs north along Airport Road, and it wasn't maintained. During the last storm event, they mentioned it was not maintained because our development happened during the recession. That bunch of pipes are full of dirt. Now, we just have a ditch, has trees on both sides of the ditch. It's pretty hard to maintain the ditch. And also those trees sometimes affect the telephone lines. So I would think that they would take out one row of trees next to telephone lines, and you'd still have your screening between Palm Woods and Venetian Bay. And all you do is widen the ditch. Now you can maintain the ditch. And then we go north. There is St. Johns River's rules, but we're like a little micro watershed. And we go north all around the airport, Port Orange, and out to the ocean. So I would think that some improvements on that ditch would make a world of difference in Venetian Bay.
Thank you for your comments, sir. I think I heard one question about statistical analysis between the variants, the 2 or 3 variables, when you're doing statistics. Mr. Cunningham, maybe you'll want to talk about those variances and however the regression is done for that to come up with something that is statistically significant with those at least 2 I think you mentioned 2, maybe 3 variables.
I'm not sure we have enough time left for that. I will say, generally the way the coastal part is done independent of the inland part. So you would do statistics on the recurrence of the coastal part and then statistics on the recurrence of the rainfall. And so you're kind of making an assumption that they're independent. In reality, they're not. What makes those statistics very difficult is we have a set of statistics for when things are completely dependent and when they're completely independent. And this one happens to fall in between. So I'll give you the short answer. The statistics get very complicated. With that said, in coastal Florida, typically our biggest events come when we have a hurricane. So, and that may or may not be with a high tide, just depending on which side of the hurricane you're on. But it's not uncommon to have one of our highest rainfalls with our highest tidal conditions because of that.
Thank you very much, sir.
Doesn't
Appreciate
have
that.
to happen that way.
Ernie Jackson,
Hello.
3431 Tesoro Circle.
Hello, Colonel.
Huh?
Go right ahead.
Go ahead. Hey, I just want to thank you for having your guys come down and visit our ditches. I was an infantry guy, so ditches are important to me. And, during that flood, the water wasn't moving anywhere. And so I started walking some ditches, and your guys have discovered that they haven't been maintained very well. And we need to do a better job of that. It's got to be maybe an ordinance or something done to get the HOAs to do this kind of stuff. Then our ditches run into the county ditch. So that's a whole nother ball of wax. Now we got to get the county involved. See, these ditches go across a lot of boundaries, and everybody's got to start working together so that, because if I get my ditch clean and the guy downstream doesn't clean his ditch, well, it's just a delay of game until I get all the water coming back in. So we got to do a better job to get these ditches in good serviceable shape. And
So the subtlety there, gentlemen, Ernie, clarify, you know that your HOA owns some of those ditches.
Correct.
The city owns some ditches and the county owns some ditches, and until we get them all squared away, no one ditch is gonna handle the whole thing, right?
Amen.
All right, thank you so much for your comment.
And yeah, that's right. So the other thing is, you need to think, I found out from your guys, you need a spider, and you don't have one. But the county's got one, so we're renting it so we can do our stuff. Why don't we just buy a spider? Under the $400,000, you just got $1 million, there you go. You got 600 grand left over.
We're taking donations, so.
Huh?
We're taking your donations.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Colonel, appreciate that. Yes, sir.
Sean Kelly, 657 South Pine Street. I've spoken to the commission before regarding a concern I have on my street, and I think it's the same part of the map that Commissioner Martin was also looking at quite closely, because we live fairly close together here. And I guess I just have a couple of questions. You're talking about, maintaining, I guess, the drainage, the ditches. Does that include the grates that have been put into the city streets since this new stormwater system has been placed, for example, on Pine Street, where the water seems to come up? I don't know if you saw any issues. I guess my questions are this. Everyone I've talked to who lives on my street, Pine Street, said there was never, or very rarely was there flooding before this drainage system was put in. Water does come up through the drainage system. During Irma and Nicole, I guess, or Ian, we watched the storm had passed. My wife walked our dogs. Our driveway was free and clear of water. The drain had water over it, and before we knew it, it was gushing out of it, and suddenly we had 8 inches of water around our house. So I don't know if you looked at the drainage system within the city. I mean, you said it was a very good system. I don't doubt that, but are there parts of that system that you saw that could be improved as far as how the water is directed away from homes? I don't know if that question makes sense or not, but.
Yeah, it does. Our study included the entire city, so I couldn't tell you any specifics.
Okay, because I know we submitted videos and photographs of the water, sitting on top of that drain and then suddenly just completely flooding our street after the storm had already passed. So I just don't know if there are improvements to that system that could prevent houses in my, area of the street at least, which is Luke, who spoke earlier, has the same issue. He was talking about the drainage around his house. But so that was my first question, and I guess also, and I guess this is a city question, how often are those grates or the systems underneath of the grates cleaned out? Last time I asked that question, I was told I had to call to have that happen. But I guess in my head, I'm thinking, if you know a storm's coming, one of the things the city should just kind of autopilot do is make sure everything's cleaned out and ready to go before the storm ever gets to us. So I guess
Thanks
that's
for your question, sir. Let me see. City manager, you probably got that
Yes,
on the maintenance standpoint.
Sean, actually, we're talking to maintenance. We're trying to put quite a bit of maintenance of the stormwater system, ditches, and so forth into a system, into a software, as a matter of fact. So it will be probably, I would say, cleaned and looked at more regular than what you see now. So that's what we're going to do.
Okay, because I will say that I've never seen ours cleaned.
I'm not saying in the past, I'm saying what's
Right,
coming.
Right, but that's good to hear. I hope that happens. Okay, well, I thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you for coming. And one more comment about that. City manager was talking about storm surge, and regardless of how clean your drain is, on a high storm surge, nothing's going out, is what I remember. Tell me if I've got that right or wrong. So those guys down there may see that more often because that's where that's where the water's coming in from storm surge, or am I wrong on that?
You are absolutely correct, Mayor. And then we saw this in Irma, where the river actually went up, and any house within the Central Beach area that had an elevation of, I think it was 6.5, any house that was below 6.5 flooded, because that was the stage of the river. So regardless if you have a pipe or you don't, that water is coming. So.
Mayor, if I could.
Yeah, please.
Mr. Kelly, you said, if I heard you correctly, that people have told you that area never flooded. And I can tell you that everything you're saying is very valid. What Colin just said was exactly right during Irma, and that's when there was There's always been a problem of flooding in the Central Beach area, and that is specifically why that stormwater project, millions of dollars has been put into the Central Beach area to deal with that flooding issue. So, and of course with Irma, Commissioner Martin, her home flooded. And when I looked at the topos of that area where Commissioner Martin lives, which is where I believe you live, I was blown away that some of those elevations were as low as 4.5, and most of them didn't exceed 5.5, 5 3/4. So that is a very low area. And I do want to tell you, I'm not saying that there's not legitimate issues with, someone said a check valve. Check valve compared to a duct bill. Should be a duct bill that allows water to flow out but not flow back in. That's another discussion for another time. But I did want to stress to you and tell you that whoever told you that that area didn't have a history of flooding isn't quite accurate, because we wouldn't have put millions of dollars into that area.
Right,
if
but
it didn't.
And I just wanted to point out, we bought, 3 flood lots? There's 2 on Goodwin and 1 on Pine, and what years were that? I mean, it was.
What year?
Yeah, about what year?
2000, 2001?
Yeah, so we know, in other words, I'd love to blame it all on one thing too, but I do know that there has been.
And I'm not blaming it on one thing,
Yeah.
but it's fact that when that water comes up, it's not flooding the entire area. It's not even flooding the whole street. It's flooding the lowest part by Norwoods, which is where I live, so.
And here.
If there's,
And here.
and here as well, right. So I just don't know if there's a way to redirect, or I don't know how those pipes go underground, but it seems like it's stopping right at my foot of my driveway. So I don't know if there's a way to cover my grate or redirect that water, I don't know, but it's a concern I've had.
And that's what you're asking for, is there something that can be done? So city engineer's got that one in his hat. Yes, sir.
Name is John Vasquez. I live at 248 Golf Club Drive. That's in Fairgreen subdivision, some 500 homes. I happen to be president of my association. Behind me are a couple of gentlemen here representing another association. There's 8 of them. All of them are tied with the drainage from one to the other, hopefully to Turnbow Bay. And I understand about storm surge. If you're coming this way to drain and the water's up here, you're not going anywhere. Fully understand that, but what we've got is a storm drainage system with a lot of small ponds that are 45 to 50 years old, and we understand the HOAs in black and white says you will maintain your retention pond, but the drainage pipes, the system that takes the water from one pond to another, all that is flowing underneath city streets. I have never gotten a straight answer who owns those drainage pipes and who maintains them. And I can only imagine after 50 years what those drain pipes look like with silt and debris and lawn chairs and God knows what else. And again, if the storm surge prevents it from flowing, clean ones isn't going to solve the problem, but I think that's part of the solution. And I'd like to see some assistance partnership with the city to get that addressed. And I fully understand that 45, 50 years ago, that subdivision was laid down, developed, and approved, and no one who did that works at the city, and they're probably not even alive. But hopefully there's some record somewhere that we might have access as to see, how it works. We have no idea what we're dealing with. And we have about 500 people that are very concerned about this happening again. So,
Great point. Good question, sir. And I think his direct question is, who owns the piping? And city manager, maybe we can pop that balloon
John,
right
I
now.
could tell you this, when they constructed Venetian Bay, all these streets, except for, the Fairgreen Avenue, they were all private. And then they came about, I would say, in the mid-90s, early 2000s. They asked the city to actually turn them over to public roads. And I remember specifically, I was one of the people who were reviewing that. And my main 2 concerns were 2 things: the drainage and the width of the pavement. Your right-of-way is the width of the pavement. You have no right-of-way at all.
So that system, if you look at your plans, that system was maintained by the homeowner association of Fairgreen. So when Jerry Schweikert, if you remember Jerry Schweikert, when he built it, that's what he wanted to do. So the homeowner association maintained the system, the streets, and the retention areas. When we took over, I was actually against it, because we have no room. So you got some drainage inlets who are actually on private property. So unless if we have an easement for any of these pipes that runs from the street to the pond, we cannot maintain it. But you should have the plans for for Fairgreen. I think the HOA, I know that they have the plans.
Well, there goes that 50 years again. Where is it? Who has it?
Well, I remember I went out there probably, I would say, 10 years ago. They have them. They have them actually stored them. I'll look for one to see if we have any.
Okay.
And I could help you to show you which one, who's responsible.
But you're
for
saying that 100% that system is our problem, not the city's in any degree?
As far as I remember, that's one of the, when we took it over, your right-of-way, our right-of-way is the width of the road. So if that system is outside the road and no easement, we cannot maintain it.
Wait a minute.
It's like having a city worker working on my house.
Yeah. Well, if you can try to locate that, it would be a great help.
I will look into it, John, for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your
Thank you.
comments, sir.
Good afternoon. My name's Ken Eldikin, 51 Lake Fairgreen Circle. I would just like to know if you had any emergency vehicle problems, such as fire, police, medical, and if they were limited to certain areas they could respond to or not respond to.
During the storm, that's your question, do we have any restrictions during the storm because of
Flooding,
of
no
flooding?
surges.
Thank you so much. City manager, you got that
Yeah,
one?
we actually, our fire trucks, they're fine. All the high vehicles, they will have no problem. I think our problem was with the lower vehicles. Now, we got a left for some of the high vehicles. We had an issue with evacuating some of these residents that they flooded, and we're trying to evacuate them from their homes to a shelter. So we are purchasing some boats, number one. Number two, we are purchasing the lifts for these high vehicles so we could lift some of these elderly people that they couldn't jump on the high vehicle.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, sir. Appreciate that.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Wendy Anderson, and I live in DeLand. I'm not a New Smyrna resident, but I am an environmental scientist, and I read a lot of these reports, and one of my colleagues at Stetson is Dr. Jason Evans, who has done a lot of these kinds of studies in other coastal communities, including one in New Smyrna Beach. So one of the questions I have for you, you referenced the 1924 flood, and the event had been preceded by a wet period. Did you take into account the fact that New Smyrna Beach experienced about 13 to 15 inches of rain in the month prior to Hurricane Ian arriving? So you did already have a saturated water table. Was that part of your model?
Do you have any other questions, ma'am? Is that it?
I have a follow-up question depending on what his answer is.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Go
Yeah,
right
so-
ahead, Mr. Cunningham.
Yes, so we adjusted the model for antecedent conditions.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so you did take into account the previous month's rainfall total, which was
Correct.
excessive.
Correct.
Okay. So then my next question is, one of the gentlemen previously, I don't know, 4 or 5 speakers ago, had asked about the possibility of actually pumping out the ponds, and I'm going to address this more to the city staff. We do that over on the west side. When we have a storm coming, all of our HOAs, we pump out our ponds and draw them down. We don't have to have a permit from St. John's to do that. We just do it. It's just good practice. So I don't know if that's standard practice in your HOAs around here, but you should be doing that. But the point is, if your ground is already saturated, you don't have anywhere to pump it to. Your ground, you can send it out through irrigation and it's going to just go into the ground, but your ground's already saturated. So So there's a lot more to be said. I'm hoping to be in touch with Mayor Cleveland and Commissioner Martin after I see the full report. It's very interesting what you've presented tonight, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your comments and
Sure.
your questions, ma'am. Is there anyone else for public participation? Yes, ma'am.
Very, very interesting.
Step all the way up to the microphone and name and
sorry.
address, please. and
My
then we
name
can
is
start.
Lorette Theberge. I live at 2051 Pioneer Trail. I live in Quail Hollow mobile home, manufactured mobile home, 55 and over. And I'm very confused because I don't know, we do not own our land. We rent the land from Quail Hollow. Newbie Realty is the manager. And I don't know about, we are enveloped by a canal. The whole park is enveloped by canal, not a ditch. There's been cars that were into the canal, submerged. So it's not considered a ditch in my point of view.
Sure.
So I don't know who to go to. I have made several attempts for my my commissioner representative to call me or email me. I have received no answer whatsoever. So I've talked to Lisa before right after the hurricane. She was so kind to come right to the house. But then we've had a redistricting of the zone area for voting. So she's not any longer our zone representative. But the one who is, I never got any information from him, never answered my question. So I don't know. Now, we are on private land. So what happens to the dredging or the canal? There happens to be a deck right there, a wooden deck sitting in the canal with a lot of garbage around it. And who's going to take care of it? Some people have called the city. The city will say, oh, no, it's the county. Oh, no, the county, we can't get any hold of them. If they do come, they have dredged part of it before. And the Quail Hollow, Quail Hollow owners have dredged another part of the canal. So it sounds like it's both of them. I don't know whose responsibility it is. But the thing is still there. It's 7 months later. There's still garbage and a full deck in the canal. So we have more rain coming, probably another hurricane. And we've lost 12 homes had to be demolished. These people have been there. Our HOA was effective or started in 1984. So these people have been in that area for a long time. This was their home. Completely lost. They had to leave. And there still are people working on homes now.
So as I understand it, ma'am, you're looking for clarity on ownership, who owns it, and so the city manager will help.
Just give us your information,
Okay.
We'll be in touch so you can get that clarity. I'm not saying that we own it, but we will get you the answer of who does own it.
Yes, I would
And you should not
appreciate
be, you should be very clear at the end of that. Thank you so much. Anyone else for public participation? Seeing none, public participation is now closed. Other comments from Commissioner Martin?
None at this time. You know there'll be more later.
Sure, absolutely, and we want to have a robust discussion. For those of you still in the room, this is the city at work, and we're delighted you're here. This has high interest and high priority within the city staff and within your commission. So you can expect us to be discussing and going through this report and getting to the bottom of many of the initiatives that were proposed and many that are probably in the very long report. I have not finished the full report, but I appreciate Mr. Cunningham, you coming along with the chief engineer. And so with that, we're adjourned.